Hey everyone. Have you ever noticed that just spending hours studying doesn't necessarily mean you've actually learned anything?
Yeah, for sure. Like you can pore over a textbook forever and still walk away feeling like you didn't absorb much at all,
Exactly. And it turns out there's this fascinating concept called learning effort.
which basically means the length of the course and the time you need to understand, adhere to the content, retain and apply what you have learned. And get this, understanding it can completely change how we approach both learning and teaching.
Oh, okay. I'm already hooked. So it's less about the time itself and more about the mental effort we put in?
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're going to unpack some research from a guy named Grégoire Aribaut. He presented it at several conferences in 2020 and 2021.
Okay.
He really digs into how this learning effort idea plays out, especially in courses that blend in-person and online contents and activities, which is pretty much the norm.
Totally. It feels like everyone's juggling different learning formats now. So where does this whole effort d'apprentissage thing come in?
Well, Grégoire starts by highlighting this distinction that's super relevant to how we learn today. Synchronous versus asynchronous activities. Synchronous is all the live stuff like lectures, Zoom calls, anything that happens in real time.
Gotcha.
Asynchronous is more self-paced, like watching recorded lectures, reading assignments, or working on a project on your own time.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does that tie back to our learning effort?
Well, think about it. Have you ever just zoned out during a long lecture video?
Oh yeah, all the time.
Or like skimmed through a reading without really absorbing anything? The point is, just because you spent an hour watching or reading doesn't mean you were putting in an hour of real learning effort.
Oh man, that is so true. It's like tricking yourself into thinking you're being productive.
Totally. So how do we make sure that the time we're spending actually translates into real learning,
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
This is where things get super interesting. Grégoire introduces this idea of 20-minute learning chunks being the sweet spot for attention, comprehension, and memory. It's based on how our brains are actually wired to process information. And 20 minutes seems to be the magic number.
Oh wow. So instead of trying to force myself to watch like a 2-hour lecture video all at once, I should break it down into smaller bites.
That's exactly right. And this applies to both synchronous and asynchronous learning. So, for live classes, this means perhaps 20 minutes of teaching, then a break, or switching to an activity for another 20 minutes before completing what he calls a cycle with 20 minutes of sharing and feedback. In the case of self-paced learning, long readings can be interrupted or a timer set to watch only part of the presentation. This ties in with one of these videos about Pomodoro, by the way.
I never really thought about it that way, but it makes so much sense. It feels way less overwhelming when you tackle things in smaller chunks.
It's all about working with how our brains naturally operate. But Grégoire takes this a step further and introduces an actual formula for calculating the learning effort. It might sound a little intimidating at first, but it actually helps to illustrate how much more goes into learning than just the raw time we spend on something.
Ooh, a formula. I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
Okay, so here it is. X is the course, and F equals D times C, and the total could be multiplied by V. Now, before you freak out, let's break it down. F just represents the total learning time you're putting in. Then we have D, which stands for production time. C is the difficulty factor, and V the intellective one.
Okay. So production time is that basically just the amount of time you physically spend to read a text, watch a video, or listen a podcast.
Yeah, like how many minutes you spend reading a chapter or watching that video. But here's the key. Just because you spend an hour on something doesn't mean you put in a full hour of learning effort.
Oh, right. Because sometimes you're just kind of there, but not really absorbing anything.
Exactly. And that's where C comes in, the coefficient of difficulty.
Which makes total sense, because some things are just harder to learn than others, even if they take up the same amount of time.
Right. So the harder something is to grasp, the higher the coefficient of difficulty, and the more effort it takes to really learn it. You can think of it like lifting weights.
Okay, I like this analogy. So lifting a 50-pound weight might be easy for a bodybuilder, but for me, it'd be a completely different story.
Exactly. Same amount of time spent lifting, but the effort is totally different depending on your strength and experience. So the last piece of this formula is V, the intellective variable.
Interesting. What does that cover?
This is where things get really personal. V takes into account things like your existing knowledge, how motivated you are, or whether you have any learning disabilities that might affect your effort level.
So it's like everyone comes to the table with their own strengths, challenges, and those influence how much effort they need to invest to learn something new.
Precisely. And by acknowledging this, we can start to design learning experiences that are actually tailored to individual needs and strengths.
This is blowing my mind. I'd never thought about learning in this way before.
It's a whole new way of looking at things, and we've only just scratched the surface. Next, we'll explore how Grégoire actually applies this formula to specific course designs to give us an use case and even exam structure.
Oh, I can't wait. This is seriously making me rethink how I approach studying.
Well, get ready, because it's about to get even more insightful. Grégoire's work has some serious implications for how we design courses, how we assess learning, and how we can all become more effective learners.
Okay,
So let's take what we know about learning effort and see how it actually plays out in the real world. Grégoire uses this example of a typical one-credit course to illustrate this, and he suggests that students should expect to invest about 45 hours of total effort for a course like that in Quebec, Canada.
45 hours, huh? That's a pretty hefty chunk of time. How does that actually break down?
He starts by taking into account the time spent in class. Let's say this one-credit course has 5 3-hour sessions. Let's do that. That's 15 hours. That leaves 30 hours for all the rest. And let's say there's a pretty big individual or group project that takes up around 5 hours of that time.
Okay, so let's say you count it for 20 hours. Where do those remaining 25 go?
This is where Grégoire's formula comes back into play. Remember, we're talking about total learning effort, not just the time you literally spend in class or working on a project. So he uses his formula, the F equals D multiplied by C, to calculate the expected personal effort students will need to put in outside of those scheduled class sessions.
Right. Because even if you're physically sitting in class for those 15 hours, that doesn't mean you've magically absorbed all the information or understood all the concepts.
Exactly. There's a lot of work that happens outside of class to really solidify that learning. So going back to the formula, F represents the total learning effort for each session, and D is the production time, which in this case is those 3 hours spent in class.
Gotcha.
And the last piece is what we're trying to figure out, the personal effort required outside of class.
Okay, I'm with you. So we're trying to figure out how much time students should realistically be spending outside of those 3 hours. So we're trying to figure out how much time students should be spending outside of those 3-hour classes to actually master the material.
Precisely. And Grégoire, using his formula and factoring in like average difficulty and intellectual variables, estimates that the total of personal effort for each 3-hour session should be around 3 and 4 hours.
Whoa, 4 hours on top of the 3 hours in class? That's a lot to juggle, especially if you're taking multiple courses.
It really highlights how important time management is, and understanding where your effort needs to be focused. And keep in mind that 4-hour essays are a lot of work. And so, an estimate includes all sorts of things: reviewing lecture notes, doing the assigned readings, doing practice problems, preparing for exams, even just taking time to think about and process the material.
Yeah, that's true. It really puts into perspective all the unseen effort that goes into learning. I think a lot of students, myself included, probably underestimate that hidden effort.
It's a really common realization, and it's why Grégoire's work is so valuable. By explicitly calculating this learning effort, educators can design courses that are more realistic and manageable for students. And on the flip side, students can better understand how to effectively allocate their time and energy.
It's almost like a shared understanding of expectations. Instead of just saying, this is a one-credit course, so it should take X amount of time, we're being more honest about the mental work involved.
Exactly. It's about moving away from simply equating time spent with learning achieved and acknowledging that it's a much more nuanced process. Remember those remaining 25 hours we had for our hypothetical one-credit course?
Right. The time not spent in class or on that big project?
Grégoire uses this to emphasize how important it is for educators to be mindful of how much work they're assigning outside of class. It's easy to overload students with readings, videos, online discussions, and quizzes. But you have to consider how all of that impacts their overall learning effort.
It's not just about throwing a ton of content at students, but being more strategic and selective with what we ask them to do.
Exactly. And this is where those 20-minute learning chunks come in handy. Instead of signing like a 2-hour lesson, break it down into smaller, more digestible segments. Or instead of a dense 50-page reading, maybe assign specific sections or provide summaries or guiding questions.
It's about quality over quantity, making sure that every activity is actually contributing to deeper learning, not just adding to the workload.
Exactly. And by understanding these principles, students can become more active and empowered learners too. They can start to recognize when they're truly engaged and when they're just going through the motions.
I love that. It's about taking ownership of your own learning and being more intentional with your time and energy. It's not just about checking things off a list. It's about actually engaging with the material.
And ultimately, that leads to a more fulfilling and rewarding learning experience. But it's not just about individual students managing their time and effort. Grégoire takes this concept even further, suggesting that even exam design should be approached with effort in mind. Its aim is twofold. It wants students to give their best during an exam, and at the same time it seeks to calculate the volume of questions best suited to the length of the exam to limit the risk of cheating.
This is something I think a lot of students can relate to. Have you ever felt like an exam was totally out of sync with the actual learning that happened in the course? Like you studied hard, but the questions felt like they came out of left field?
Absolutely. And Grégoire argues that this disconnect often comes from a failure to align assessments with the actual effort required to learn the material. It's not just about testing what students can remember, but about evaluating the cognitive effort they've invested in understanding the concepts.
So it's not just about memorizing facts and figures. It's about demonstrating. You actually understand the material and the ability to apply that knowledge in different contexts.
Exactly. And this means considering the structure of the exam questions, the types of prompts used, even how feedback is delivered. It's about making sure the exam itself reflects the learning process, not just an arbitrary measure of what students can regurgitate on demand. Remember that for Grégoire, evaluation should first and foremost evaluate learning, and less so the student's job.
It really makes you wonder how much more effective learning and assessment could be if we actually took this learning effort idea seriously.
It's definitely a powerful concept, and it raises an interesting question for both educators and students. How can we make sure that the effort we're putting in is reflected in our assessments?
It's like we need to shift our thinking, not just about how we study, but about how we measure learning too. It makes me wonder if this concept could help us personalize education in a more meaningful way.
That's a great thought. What if we could tailor the content and the pacing, even the types of assessments, to each student's own effort profile?
Whoa, that would be next level. Like having a personalized roadmap that takes into account not just what you know, but how you learn best and how much effort you need to invest to really grasp a concept.
Exactly. And that gets to the heart of what makes Grégoire's research so compelling. It's not just about tweaking study habits or designing slightly better exams. It's about fundamentally rethinking how we approach learning itself.
It's about recognizing that effort matters. It's not just about the time we put in, but the mental energy in a cognitive environment. It's about the engagement we bring to the table. And maybe, just maybe, understanding this concept could help unlock a deeper level of learning for everyone.
I think so too. By understanding a learning effort concept, we can become more effective learners, more efficient learners, and ultimately, more joyful learners.
Well, this has been an incredibly eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I have a whole new perspective on what it actually means to learn.
That's great to hear. And remember, this is just the beginning. There's so much more to explore when it comes to understanding.
I'm definitely feeling inspired to keep digging. What other factors might influence learning effort? Are there any tools or techniques we could use to measure and manage it more effectively?
Those are fantastic questions. I definitely encourage you to keep exploring them. Read more about Grégoire's work on the Novagogy YouTube channel. Try out different study strategies, and pay attention to what feels most engaging and effective for you. Learning is a journey, not a destination. And I'd say we took a pretty big step forward today.
I totally agree. Happy learning, everyone!
See you next time.